things, and both of you talked about this in similar ways, but also in different ways, is the definition of diversity. What is DEI, right? And I'm curious about how each of you are approaching that in the marketplace. You just secured a recent round of funding yourself as well. So I'm curious, I guess, two things. A, are you leading with the description of those 5 different minority populations that you share with us, or are you waiting for them to ask? Right. In other words, are they expecting or assuming it's going to be one way or the other? And then for yourself, coming across as a white male, do you then have to kind of go out of your way and say, I am half Japanese and Native American, so I do understand the minority world also? I'm curious about how you're both kind of approaching that.
So I would go through and say, I could put it in 2 buckets. One, just in my own, I started my first company in the mid-90s because that was the only way I could get to the leadership role. Yeah, sure. And that, interesting enough, still is the same issue for women and people of color, is to be able to get access to the C-suite. You're going to start something on your own. So that was one. But the other, I just wanted to, solve big problems. But I found that, and the other, kind of route that I got into, back to what Kurt mentioned about, different, kind of buckets. I was a software engineer by training. So, I was in the industry that typically is, white males. Those are the guys that I was in AP classes with in high school and in college. Those were my colleagues. And I wanted to do the same things they did. We all wanted to be Bill Gates. I started my career as a software engineer at NCR developing ATM and point of sale system infrastructure, and thought, what, I should have the same opportunity as my colleagues did because, they were, and at the time, interestingly enough, they had a DEI initiative. Now, really? DEI is not, this is the new name, but if you go back other decades, there's always been a DEI initiative. And in fact, how I got introduced to DEI is through my dad. My dad was a Vietnam veteran who came to California to be stationed here to work on a project for Admiral Zumwalt to integrate the Navy in the 70s. And that was my first exposure to DEI in the 70s. And if you go through and look, every decade we've had a new version of DEI.
Repackaging.
Exactly. Yeah. And the reality for them, they looked at the fact that they're going from a draft, mandatory draft, to a voluntary draft, and when they looked at the performance of their soldiers, that they needed to be able to do the business of the Defense Department by it being more inclusive, and not just having them in the lower ranks, but having them in leadership roles. And it was that initiative that spawned Colin Powell and all these other people, because that was a long time ago. And so, looking at, kind of fast forward, 50 years from then, I look at it, when I just launched Founders First, it was from a standpoint of there are, a degree of representation, marginalization of different groups, and that there are some commonalities, and that can help serve the market. So looking at the social mission of what we do, but then the other side of it, as Kurt brought up, the economic side of it, is that it just like in the defense of the country, it's good for defending the country if it represents the whole citizenry. The same is for the economic, the private economic component of our country, but it's not. People don't have that same sense of urgency that was in the government, because the reality is, it's like, let's use a similar analogy to what Kurt used. Imagine if we only play with only a certain group of people. I mean, there's so many industries that have embraced diversity, like our professional sports industry, and it's so much better than where it was before. And so it's really having folks look at it and as opposed to or, and that we are a better and stronger country and economy when it is inclusive. And so that's been the way that I have gone about it, is that, being somebody in elementary school and seeing, oh my gosh, okay, I see what happened with the military. And for them, it was like either you embrace it or you're out, regardless of what rank you were,
Yeah, sure.
because that's what they wish we had the same, recognition. Because when you look at other countries, they don't have as much heterogeneous makeup as we do in the U.S. I travel a lot. This is what makes us so strong. We are a young country and we have fought through so many things, but this has not been one thing that we've been able to embrace enough. And when we do, just like the military.
It's also, there's been research out for 10, 15 years, and every year it comes back with the same results, that the companies that have a more diverse executive team, not just the board, but also an executive leadership team, they outperform the S&P by 15, 18, sometimes 20%, depending upon the year.
The latest results from Goldman and McKinsey is it's up to 30%.
30%, yeah, exactly.
But the ones that go through and do it in all these different pockets, and then you look at some of the companies like Disney. Disney has gone through from board all the way down to their product offering. Their movies are inclusive because they recognize that they're able to attract the whole viewing audience, not just one segment.
Well, that's where it comes back to the economic side. We should be doing it just in general for just as humans,
recognize
but look at just the economic side.
Exactly.
Because you have more diversity of thought, you have more ideas, more perspectives. As I talk about all the time, my whole team is myself, and I have 6 women on my team, and the perspectives that I get from them, including Vicky in the back here, is so different than if I had myself and 6 other white males. It just is, right? And so things that I think are priorities or things that I think are going to be relevant for the audience are different when you have different people that are giving you that input and that feedback. So that makes us a better organization as a whole versus just 6 other clones of me. That's a big difference. So Kurt, how about yourself?
Yeah, well, let me piggyback on an example, and then I'll answer your question. When I started Gun Lake Investments, first it was just me and a laptop in a co-working space. It wasn't much of a company. And then as we grew, because of the focus on the Native American community, I added 2 Native Americans. The board was all Native American, and then the ownership was obviously Native American through the tribe. And then as we started interviewing and hiring, we hired a couple of white people. And after about 6 months, it was really interesting. And there was on an employee engagement survey, there was a comment about essentially how they felt like an outcast. And I knew who it was. We were a small firm. And to actually address, a white male about them feeling a bit discriminated against because they weren't Native American really opened my eyes to the power of diversity or the lack of diversity or the issues, right? And so this is just 2 years ago. And so it's easy to see how it can go the other way the other way. And one thing we don't talk about, I don't think enough, is that diversity includes everybody.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And on my board for Include, while we're growing it, but there's a white male on it. Why? Because this individual is passionate about the space, understands the issues, and has great experience that Include can benefit from. Diversity doesn't mean excluding white people, and it doesn't mean excluding males, right? It doesn't, right? It's about ensuring that we have that kind of comprehensive viewpoint.
Right.
And so for Include, the way that our focus is on racial diversity primarily, because I have a way to work that directly into the strategy and have an activity system that builds around that. And while we are kind of generally focused on diversity as a whole, we're taking a kind of broad definition of diversity in terms of ethnicity, but we're not including kind of a class outside of an ethnic or racial kind of background.
Gotcha.
And that's not because we're excluding anybody. Again, we still need diversity. And so the hiring is not going to exclude anybody. It's not going to be focused just on minorities. But in terms of being able to communicate to the market about what it is that we're doing, and this is a big part of it because it is so new, we decided to focus directly on more of that kind of ethnic or racial background,
Gotcha.
as opposed to expanding it further. But the same principles that apply to how do we expand our networks and relationships apply beyond the racial and ethnic backgrounds that we have to do. I myself have not done that yet, because as we were talking, about there could be 25 priorities, and especially with startups, right? Everything you do could be done better. And so let's focus on what it is that we're doing extremely well, and then expand from that. I think one of the reasons why it hasn't happened, we know the economic impact for the country. We know the capitalistic motivations, right, as investors and business people. But one of the reasons why I believe it hasn't happened is because a lot of us are just, I venture to say, embarrassed, right, and not know how to approach it, right? And I myself, I was embarrassed when I realized a year ago, we went out to hire for a COO. This was the second time that we had gone out and done like investments. So I guess about a year and a half to 2 years ago. And of the about approximately 100 resumes we received for a COO, there's only 3 diverse candidates. All 3 were Native American. And actually, one turned out to be the most qualified candidate. But what was interesting to me is I had thought, because we are minority owned and we promote the minority space, that we're going to get diverse candidates. The fact is that I was naive and a bit ignorant to think, well, I've not built relationships beyond the Native American community. That was also something that inspired me to build something that's a bit more inclusive beyond just the Native American community. And gave me the space to explore, how do I do this? But I was embarrassed that, that my friend network, it wasn't diverse outside of the Native American community. And I was embarrassed not to know how to do it. And I was embarrassed to raise my hand and ask, how is it that I do this?
Right, yeah.
I'll end this with, there's an individual named, I think, Mav Carter, who's the business manager for LeBron James. Everybody knows who LeBron James is. Mav is actually the person who's making LeBron James more money than what he's making in basketball. And early in the pandemic, the New York Times did a podcast with him. And the other part about this sense of embarrassment is he points out that we're beaten over the head with the term racism. And we all know that racism exists, but we also know that there's some good people that aren't necessarily racist, but they have bias. We all have bias, all of us, right? And that bias prevents us from seeing beyond what's in front of us unless we actually work to break down that bias. He makes the point, it gets us to the same exact place. Whether it's bias or it's true racism, it gets us to the same result. So we have to recognize that we have bias that's preventing us from doing this, which puts us into an uncomfortable position, which I believe is part of the reason why the U.S. has not moved faster to become more inclusive. That's what, I'm an optimist by nature. I want to believe that's true. But we have the ability, all of us in this room have the ability to show how it can be done, why it should be done, and empathize with those that want to make it happen, but don't necessarily know.